Smallmouth bass. Pound for pound, more anglers rate this fish above every other freshwater game fish in North America for one reason. It fights harder than anything else its size. Smallmouth bass hunt on the move, chasing prey through open current over rock and gravel, rather than ambushing from cover, with crayfish making up close to half of an adult's diet in many rivers, rounded out by baitfish and aquatic insects picked off current seams and eddies. That active, current-driven lifestyle builds a fish that goes fully airborne the moment it's hooked. Full aerial jumps are routine, a fighting style distinct enough that anglers nicknamed the species bronzeback and consistently rank it as the hardest-pulling black bass alive, despite topping out well below largemouth in average size. Spawning happens each spring once water hits the high 50s to low 60s degrees Fahrenheit, with males fanning a nest over gravel or rock and guarding it aggressively enough to strike at intruders many times their own size, standing watch alone until the fry disperse. Growth runs noticeably slower than a largemouth's, especially in the northern half of its range, but that trade-off buys real longevity. 6 to 14 years is typical, with some individuals living considerably longer in cold, stable water. Native to cold, clear water from Minnesota and Quebec down to the Tennessee River, it's since been introduced across nearly every U.S. state outside the Rockies, and it's earned every one of those introductions through reputation alone. Two distinct regional strains, the Neosho and Ouachita smallmouth of the Ozark and Ouachita Highlands, remain genuinely at risk today, squeezed out generation by generation, as stocking programs quietly mix in outside smallmouth genetics from other river systems, diluting a wild lineage most anglers never even realize they're fishing for. Spotted bass. Spotted bass split the difference between their two more famous cousins, smaller mouth than a largemouth, more current tolerant than either, and carrying one feature neither of those fish has at all, a distinct patch of small teeth on the tongue, alongside rows of small dark spots below the lateral line that give the species its name. Native across the Mississippi River Basin and Gulf Coast drainages from the Carolinas to Texas, spotted bass favor clearer, more current-influenced water than largemouth typically tolerate, river channel bends, bridge pilings, submerged brush, schooling more consistently than their weed-loving cousins, and suspending over open water to run down shad in loose, coordinated packs, rather than hunting as solitary ambush predators. That schooling instinct, and a genuine taste for open water most other black bass avoid, puts them ecologically closer to smallmouth than to the fish they're most often confused with at the boat. Diet shifts with the season. Shad and other baitfish dominate when schools are running, but crayfish and aquatic insects picked off structure make up the bulk of feeding once bait scatters. It's also a notably fast-maturing fish, with many populations reaching spawning age within 2 to 3 years, a quick reproductive turnaround that will matter a great deal by the time this list reaches its most disruptive member. Shoal bass. Shoal bass are built for the roughest water any black bass regularly lives in. Fast, turbulent, rock-strewn river shoals, where they hold in current breaks behind boulders and ambush crayfish, aquatic insects, and small fish swept past by the flow, using raw swimming power rather than stealth to stay in position against current that would exhaust a largemouth. That strength translates directly into a fighting reputation. Anglers who target shoal bass specifically often rank it as the hardest-pulling river bass in the entire family, a fish that turns the current itself into a weapon the moment it's hooked. Spawning takes place directly on exposed gravel shoals each spring, a habitat requirement so specific that the species simply cannot reproduce anywhere else. No backup nesting strategy, no fallback to slower water. That total dependence on flowing shoal habitat has made it one of the more endangered species in the genus. Dams have eliminated it from most of the Chattahoochee River in Alabama by converting the fast, rocky water it needs into still reservoir the species can't use at all, while pollution and sediment runoff have done comparable damage to populations in parts of Florida. It's now formally protected in Alabama, harvest prohibited outright, even as individuals can still reach a genuinely impressive 24 inches and nearly 9 pounds. Proof that size alone isn't what determines whether a fish survives. Habitat is. Suwannee bass. For most of the year, Suwannee bass looks like an unremarkable, heavy-bodied little river fish, brown, olive-mottled, easy to overlook entirely. Then spawning season arrives, and breeding males flush a bright, unmistakable turquoise blue across the cheeks, breast, and belly, a color no other black bass in North America has ever been documented showing. That transformation sits on top of a fish built entirely around one narrow kind of water. Its range is about as restricted as this genus gets, almost entirely confined to the Suwannee Suwannee and Oxlaconi river systems of Florida and Georgia, plus a handful of connected spring-fed tributaries, rarely straying into lakes or reservoirs at all. It's a specialist by build as much as by geography, a heavy-set, powerful little fish, adapted to hold position against rocky shoals and moderate to swift current, feeding heavily on crayfish, alongside small fish and aquatic insects, and even taking blue crabs, where its range brushes up against estuarine water near the coast. First described as its own species in 1949, it's never drawn much dedicated fishing pressure given its size. The all-tackle world record, caught in the Suwannee River in 1985, weighed just 3 pounds 14 ounces. But pound for pound, anglers who do target it specifically call it one of the hardest fighters in the entire family on light tackle, and its total dependence on clean, spring-fed flow makes it one of the more quietly vulnerable species on this list. Not because of any single dramatic threat, but because the exact narrow habitat it needs barely exists anywhere else on the map. Redeye bass. Redeye bass is identifiable at a glance by its namesake red eyes and a white-edged tail fin, a small, stream-adapted black bass confined to small, cool headwater streams across Alabama, Georgia, the Carolinas, and Tennessee. Water too small, too shaded, and too cold for almost any other member of this genus to bother with. It favors shaded, insect-rich creeks it rarely leaves for the reservoirs downstream, and its diet reflects that scaled-down world. Aquatic insects and small invertebrates dominate through most of its life, with fish entering the diet only as individuals near their maximum size of roughly 19 inches and a bit over 5 pounds. Genuinely modest numbers next to a largemouth or Alabama bass, but respectable for a fish adapted to water barely large enough to hold it. That preference for isolated headwater habitat created a real vulnerability once humans got involved. When Redeye bass were introduced into Tennessee streams for sport fishing in the 1950s, they eventually expanded downstream into water already holding native smallmouth bass and produced fertile, back-crossing hybrids that have been altering both species' genetics there ever since, a slow-motion mixing that's still playing out today, decades after the original stocking decision. Guadalupe bass. The official state fish of Texas exists almost nowhere else on Earth, and by the early 1990s, biologists were watching it disappear from its own home rivers in real time. Guadalupe bass are native exclusively to the spring-fed rivers of central Texas, stretches of the Brazos, Colorado, Guadalupe, and San Antonio basins, built specifically for clear, flowing water, rather than the still reservoirs most other black bass tolerate comfortably. A streamlined, current-adapted body, a habit of holding station in riffles and current breaks, mottled olive bronze coloring that camouflages it against gravel stream beds. It's a relatively short-lived fish, typically around 7 years, feeding on aquatic insects, crayfish, and small fish it can intercept without leaving the current it's braced against. The threat that nearly erased it arrived by accident. Smallmouth bass, introduced directly into Guadalupe bass rivers between 1974 and 1980 for sport fishing, hybridize readily, and worse, the resulting hybrids are fully fertile and backcross more often into smallmouth than back into pure Guadalupe bass, meaning every generation of hybridization pulled the population further from its native genetics, with no natural way to reverse course. Combined with habitat loss from damming and reduced stream flow, entire river populations of pure Guadalupe bass were quietly vanishing. In 1991, Texas Parks and Wildlife launched the Guadalupe Bass Restoration Initiative in direct response, a partnership that eventually pulled in the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, the Nature Conservancy, and private landowners along the rivers themselves, physically removing smallmouth bass and hybrids from a stretch of river, then restocking it with genetically verified pure Guadalupe bass to rebuild an isolated, self-sustaining population from the ground up. More than 3 decades later, that initiative has restored fishable, genetically pure populations to 15 central Texas rivers, backing a fishery worth an estimated $71 million in economic activity over a single 16-month survey period. A remarkable payoff for a fish that on paper almost never breaks 2 pounds. Alabama bass. There's a black bass species dismantling other black bass fisheries across the eastern United States right now, in real time, reservoir by reservoir, and almost every time it shows up somewhere new, an angler put it there. Alabama bass is native to river systems across Alabama, and it spreads outside that range almost entirely one way. An angler catches a few, likes how aggressively they bite and how fast they grow, and dumps a bucket of them into a completely different lake hundreds of miles away, hoping to build a faster action fishery back home. It's a illegal nearly everywhere it happens, and it's nearly impossible to trace after the fact, because Alabama bass look close enough to native spotted bass and largemouth that most anglers moving them can't actually tell what they're carrying. Once established, they do two things at once, and both are devastating. They outcompete largemouth directly for food and spawning habitat by feeding more efficiently in open, sparsely covered water, and they hybridize with smallmouth and spotted bass wherever ranges overlap. Hybrids that are fully fertile and capable of backcrossing into either parent species, so the genetic dilution doesn't stop after one generation, it compounds year after year. The numbers tell the story better than any description can. At North Carolina's Lake Norman, Alabama bass have driven a well-documented dramatic decline in what was once a prized largemouth fishery. Tournament anglers there now routinely report catching 5 Alabama bass for every 1 largemouth they manage to find. At Fontana Lake, genetic sampling of fish still labeled smallmouth bass found 75% of them already carried Alabama bass genes. On the Catawba River chain to the east, at Lake James, that hybridization rate sat at 33%, roughly a decade, biologists estimate, behind where Fontana already is, and heading in the exact same direction. At Lake Gaston, Alabama bass made up just 8% of the total bass population in 2016. By the mid-2020s, that share had climbed past 32%. By late 2024, wildlife biologists had confirmed the species in North Carolina's Roanoke and Tar rivers, coastal river systems hundreds of miles from where it was first detected in the state over 40 years earlier. It's not an ecological catastrophe in the way an invasive carp is. It doesn't collapse an ecosystem outright. It simply outhunts and outbreeds the exact fish anglers value most. So gradually, that most lakegoers don't notice the shift until the fishery they grew up on has quietly become a different one entirely. Largemouth bass. Everything on this list builds to one fish, the most widely distributed, most heavily targeted freshwater game fish on the planet, native from the Great Lakes down through the Mississippi Basin into Mexico, and introduced to every continent except Antarctica for sport fishing. A largemouth bass hunts by pure ambush, holding motionless against a weed edge, a laydown log, or a dock piling, using its lateral line to feel prey moving nearby before it can even see it. The strike itself is almost instantaneous. The bass flares its gill covers and rapidly expands its mouth cavity, generating enough suction to inhale prey more than half its own body length in one motion. A foot-long bluegill, a swimming snake, even a duckling, on occasion, and on rare occurrences, a smaller bass, including its own recently hatched young. Diet shifts hard with age. Fry start on zooplankton within days of hatching, move on to insect larvae and tiny crustaceans through their first summer, and become almost fully piscivorous by their second year, targeting shad, bluegill, crayfish, and frogs. That diet shift powers genuinely fast growth. A largemouth in a productive southern reservoir can reach a pound or more in its first year alone, and a typical lifespan of around 16 years in good habitat, though juveniles themselves face heavy predation from herons, larger bass, and bigger predatory fish before they're large enough to turn the tables. Spawning turns this normally solitary predator openly aggressive. In spring, once water hits the low to mid-60s degrees Fahrenheit, males fan out a shallow nest in sand or gravel and guard it with open hostility, striking at anything that drifts too close. Aggression so reliable that bed fishing, deliberately targeting guarding males, remains one of the more controversial tactics in the entire sport, since pulling a male off his nest even briefly can leave the eggs exposed to bluegill and cause the whole nest to fail. The species anchors the largest tournament fishing industry of any freshwater fish in North America, an economic engine built almost entirely around chasing this one animal. And the record book delivers the strangest ending in this whole family. George Perry's 22-pound, 4-ounce largemouth, caught in Georgia in 1932 using his only lure, stood alone for 77 years until Japanese angler Manabu Kurita landed a bass a fraction of an ounce heavier from Lake Biwa in 2009, too close to officially break the record under IGFA rules. Rather than replacing Perry's name, Kurita's catch joined it. Two anglers, 77 years and roughly 6,700 miles apart, locked in an official tie neither one has ever broken, for the single most popular game fish on the entire continent.